I just started.
Perfect. So let's begin. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Leslie Juliana Lopera Bedoya. Today we are presenting Conditions of Learning, presented by authors themselves, Dr. Brian Cambourne and Deborah Crouch. This dialogue will be moderated by our faculty professor, Hugo Fernando Mesa Ortiz. Our webinar today will follow the next structure. During the first hour, we will listen to the guest speaker's presentation, and this will be followed by a Q&A section in which we will have the possibility to engage into a conversation with the authors, Brian and Debra, in the second part of our webinar. That is, if you have any questions during the presentation, please keep them or type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. And Professor Hugo Mesa will bring them up during the Q&A session again. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Please try to keep your microphones on mute during the first part of our webinar to ensure better communication and a better understanding of the presentation that is going to be shared. And now, without any further ado, we will turn time to Professor Hugo Mesa, who is going to be the host and the moderator of today's session. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Debra.
Good morning.
We are aware you are in different time zones, and we really appreciate you being here. I'm going to take very short. I'm going to actually introduce our speakers, but I'm going to try very concrete in doing that. I must accept that I'm a little nervous about doing so, but still. Thank you, all of you, for taking part in this space. It really is an honor for me to introduce our speakers for this session, who I'm sure would lead us to reflect in our practices and overall sense as teachers. Joining us today and also making this possible, we have Richard Owen. Richard is the publisher of Deborah's and Brian's latest book, Made for Learning: How Conditions of Learning Guide Teaching Decisions, which is an update of the book, The Whole Story, Natural Learning and the Acquisition of Literacy in the Classroom, which Brian wrote back in the 80s, and that actually set it out for many of us to get to know his work. So thank you very much for being with us, Richard. We also have then as one of the main speakers, Deborah Crouch. Deborah has been involved in education for the past 32 years as a classroom teacher, as a coach, as a consultant, and an author. She works as an independent literacy consultant, collaborating with the schools in designing professional learning opportunities. Her work empowers teachers, principals, and coaches to envision instructional decisions that matter for children. Decisions about the process for learning that unfold over time across tests and among practices. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Debra, and for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with all of us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. And we have also as one of our main speakers, Dr. Brian Camber. Brian actually, he actually set up for, in my personal case, and I think in the case of many of us who are here, reflections upon our practices. And that happened as a result of the book, his book, the one that I mentioned before, The Whole Story, Natural Learning and the Acquisition of Literacy in the Classroom. Brian Camber is a principal fellow at the University of Wollongong in Australia. He's considered one of the most eminent researchers of literacy and learning. He began teaching, as many of us began teaching, in primary schools in Australia. Then he completed his PhD at James Cook University before becoming a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He was a Fulbright scholar, a research fellow at the Center for Studies in Reading at the University of Illinois, and a research fellow at the Learning Center at Tucson. his work on the conditions of learning have an influence and an impact on teaching practices that are coming across or that are put into action by many teachers and educators around the world, including myself. So it really is an honor again to have all of you here, sharing your experiences, your knowledge with us. Really, I know it is a space for enriching our perspectives and enduring our reflections as well. Thank you very much, and the floor is all yours. No further ado.
Thank you, Hugo. I have very fond memories of my visit to Medellin many years ago, and I've always admired the effort and the commitment of your educators. When I was there, they were faced with some awful political problems, but they dealt with them and helped me learn a great deal about your country. So let me begin today by telling you that I've got notes in front of me, and every now and then you'll see me looking down. You need to understand that I've only got one eye that works. This eye is blind, and sometimes I lose the place. But Debra will pick me up when I lose the place and pull me back on course again. So both Debra and I want to begin by acknowledging and honouring your journey to becoming classroom teachers. As you spend more and more time in your apprenticeships in classrooms and analyse instruction, you're either observing or delivering yourself. It's important to recognise how the concepts of teaching and learning have changed and continue to change over time. Let me give you an example of how teaching has changed. I began teaching in January 1956, and upon graduation, we were given a large, hard-covered blue book that was called the New South Wales Syllabus of Instruction. We called it the Blue Bible. It contained specific details of what we were expected to teach in each curriculum area from K right through to grade 6, how many minutes per week we would give to each subject in each area in each grade, and a sequence of skills and knowledge to be mastered in each grade. It was our technical manual for doing our job. We were totally dependent on it. Now, you might be thinking how great it would be to have that right now. Be careful what you wish for. Obviously, the 2-year course that I did was designed to produce teacher technicians who could implement a curriculum which academic so-called experts who worked in offices far away from our classrooms, they developed. The idea that teachers could be curriculum developers was considered impractical and unachievable when I first began teaching. Today, it's quite different. You're expected to be a curriculum developer and to interpret theories for yourself. Here is a list of some current theories about learning in the psychological literature. New ones are being generated. Many of them conflict and deny each other. How do you know which one is right? This may be how you feel right now. Our experience is that there is often a feeling of dissonance. We want to reassure anyone feeling such dissonance is completely normal. What is essential is that you examine your values and beliefs and see how they align with the practices that you're observing. This quote from McCoskey is something to keep in mind when you consider research. Although scientists rely on research values, such as predictive accuracy and testability, scientific research is still subject to the unscientific values, attitudes, and emotions of scientists. Notice how we've underlined the last part. That's really the essential thing for me. No theory is purely objective. Many of them are not about learning. They're more about teaching. In other words, they're more about what a teacher or a program she's implementing needs to do. So as we consider the validity of any theory of learning we might adopt and try to decide whether it supports our own practices and beliefs, one thing we need to consider is whether this theory focuses primarily on learning or on teaching. As a new teacher, you may be thinking, but I want to focus on teaching because that's what I have to do now that I'm in charge of a classroom. The need to focus on teaching is understandable because when you're learning to be a teacher, we feel a need to focus on what we have to do as the leader in our own classroom. Now, Deb's going to give you our agenda.
As we are in this session, one of the things that we want to think about is really what that means when we say focusing on learning before focusing on teaching. And so what we're going to do is dig in a little bit on this idea of theories and values and beliefs about learning and think about, what is it that we believe about learning? And think about some of the kinds of decision making using a theory of learning. So we're going to take conditions of learning and talk about how are we making decisions using that theory as our base. And one of the things we want to introduce to you, which is some of the newer thinking in the new book versus in the whole story, is this idea about different categories of decision making. So thinking about, as a classroom teacher, there are different areas that you are going to be supporting in your classroom, and you can use those different areas to support different decision making. Okay, so we'll dig into all of these as we go. So when Brian and I began this book, Made for Learning, we began this book with stories of our own professional journeys. And so my story began with a confession. When I first became responsible for my own classroom, while my degree and my certificate said that I was a teacher, and, I had some sense of what a classroom was supposed to be like and run like, I'll be honest, because I really felt like an imposter. I kept thinking, I am not really sure if I could say how you teach someone to learn to read or to write or to do math. If someone had come into my classroom and asked me, I'm not sure I could have put it into words. And I was scared to death that somebody was actually going to do that. And that's really what began me beginning to explore professional readings and all of that kind of thing. And so one of the things I did was I was reading professional books, and I would go to any workshop that came out because I was just like Sally here. So I'll give you a moment to look at that little cartoon. This was me going from professional workshop to professional workshop to professional workshop to this book to that book. And I kept thinking, somebody's going to tell me the answer and I'll know what to do. And one of the things that I was so fortunate to have was a colleague that I could have great discussions with. And one of the first books that we read together, and we made our own little 2-person book club, was The Whole Story. And when we found Brian's book and we learned about the conditions of learning, what it really did was it helped us to understand what our theory of belief was about learning. And so we began approaching teaching through that lens. And so one of the things that, as we were reading in The Whole Story was just that notion that learning is what our purpose is in the classroom. Like it's helping someone to learn. And that sounds like, well, isn't that what the description of teaching is? But there's some subtle differences that we're going to dig into. Here on this photo or this slide, you can see lots of photos of different children, right? And they're all engaged in learning. Irrespective of culture or background, the way that children learn is universal. And it occurs in many different settings, and it's also continuous. right? It's continuous as children engage in the world. You know, we've had so many people talking about learning loss over this past, you know, during this pandemic, and children were learning regardless. I mean, home, they're learning different. They may be learning different things, but they are learning nonetheless. You know, learning is not something that you can turn on and off like it's a tap. It just happens. And Frank Smith reminds us that children do not need to be taught that they can learn. They believe their brains are all potent until they learn otherwise. And it is a belief that I have that sometimes that learning otherwise is what happens when they come to school. There's a distinct difference between children after 2 or 3 years of school sometimes. So this quote from Smith, you know, it's been validated repeatedly by research in the neurosciences. You know, it reminds us that learning is to the brain what breathing is to the lungs. You know, it's what it's made for. And it directs us to refocus on the learner and the learning rather than the teacher and the teaching. You know, the core of Smith's quote, the core message of Smith's quote is that children are made for learning.
And these beliefs about children are at the core of the conditions of learning that you've been learning about in your course. These beliefs and values are examples of how learning has evolved and has continued to evolve over time. We believe when teachers adopt this way of thinking about learning, it will enable them to plan and justify what needs to occur to align their practices with their values, which is another way of saying align your practice with your theory. In our book, Made for Learning, we challenge the perception that what happens in classrooms is first and foremost about teaching. We want to make significant modification to how you think about the relationship between teaching and learning. Rather than thinking that learning is a student's response to what a teacher does, we want you to reverse that relationship. Teaching is a teacher's response to what a learner does or tries to do. Let me say that again. It's important. Rather than thinking that learning is a student's response to what the teacher does, reverse this relationship. Teaching is a teacher's response to what a learner does or tries to do. This is a very different to the traditional views of learning we've all been exposed to. The model of learning you have learned about is represented here in this visual. Let's take a few minutes to talk about the conditions of learning. Deb and I both believe that all learning begins with a demonstration of some kind. However, a learner must first engage with the demonstration before any learning can begin. That is why in our visual, engagement is placed in the center. It is the fundamental condition for learning to occur. For Deb and I, engagement is a complex phenomenon. It has overtones of attention and attending. Before one can learn from a demonstration, one must first engage with it. The depth of attention and what a learner might actually attend to is in turn affected by a range of emotional, social, and ecological factors which need to be met. Here's what's emerged from years of observational research. 4 principles of engagement must be present and all must work together if engagement is to occur. One principle is that the learner must see themselves as doers of the behaviour in which they are immersed. If for any reason you have doubts that you are capable of learning what is being demonstrated, the depth of engagement will be shallow. Another principle is learners understand how these demonstrations are important to their lives. A huge part of engagement is understanding the purpose of what is being learned and how it benefits your own life. A third principle is that learners believes they aren't risking physical or psychological harm by attempting the behaviour. A learner has to feel a sense of freedom to make approximations of what is being learned. We wouldn't try anything if it had to be perfect right away, and certainly not if we risk being demeaned or physically hurt because our approximations weren't perfect. The fourth principle concerns the relationship between the learner and the teacher. A learner's willingness to engage depends on prior emotional bonding with the one doing the teaching. Each of these principles apply equally to the classroom setting. We know the importance of community and the teacher-student relationship. The student must see the teacher, whether that teacher is an adult or another student, as someone trustworthy and someone worth emulating. And the learners must see themselves as capable of what we are demonstrating.
So as Brian shared, engagement must be present for someone to learn from the demonstrations, from the immersive experiences that they witness. You know, immersion and demonstration are the two conditions you see here at the top of the visual. Immersion is just that. It's being immersed in what it is that is being learned. It's being surrounded by it. And you're also surrounded by all those necessary tools. And you'll probably be also near other people who are doing that learning as well. And then demonstrations are the actions or the artifacts that help a learner make sense of what they're immersed in. And they help that learner just begin to discern how to go about what it is that they're learning. So one of the big ideas about immersion and demonstrations is that there has to be a wholeness to the examples. Okay? So not the bits and the pieces. What Harvard educator David Perkins calls elementitis, which needs no definition really, right? When we learn all the bits and pieces, and then eventually we get around to what it is the whole is. What we know is that demonstrations have to be whole. They have to be meaningful. And one of the things that also happens in a demonstration is that, for example, in a classroom, a teacher is talking about while they're showing examples of what's being learned. So those think alouds that we talk about, those are really important because they help the learner to come to understand what to attend to. And then Brian also identified 5 conditions that make engagement more likely to be there. So the first one is expectation. And expectation is powerful, isn't it? You know, these 5 work together to create the tone that would permeate. And that expectation piece is really so crucial in learning. And one of the things we know is that expectation is, you know, it's not about like, people will talk about sometimes having high standards. You know, I think of expectations as beliefs. They're about, do I believe that that learner can do this, whatever it is that they're learning? And so these beliefs are communicated to us as learners by what others say and do, you know, and they have to be unconditional to be most effective. You know, our teachers must believe that, of course, we are, you know, capable of learning. And then as crucial as the teacher believing in us, we must believe in ourselves. We must believe that we are those doers that Brian talked about as a principle of engagement. So thinking about expectation is a huge part of what makes engagement more likely to occur. And then responsibility is next here. And, you know, when you are learning something, you're the person who is taking the responsibility of the learning. You're taking it on yourself. And one really important layer in there is that you're the person who is making the decisions about how you go about learning. So what decisions are demonstrated, you're now taking responsibility for trying those things out yourself. You know, you cannot learn if someone's always making the decisions for you. So same thing happens in a classroom. You know, we have to make sure that there's a lot of responsibility for learners to take on that reading and writing. Employment is the term that we use in this model to describe practice and use of what's being learned. And as we take on responsibility and employ what's being practiced, you know, our abilities are evolving. You know, they're developing through our practice. And what's going to happen is in that practice are all of these approximations. And approximations are where we're trying things out, and as Brian said, we're not fearful that if we try something out and it doesn't work exactly, that it's still an okay thing, right? Approximations are not what our models are going to look like forever, right? Our approximations are not something that are perfect in the first times, and even after multiple tries may not be perfect. And the attempts we make today are not going to be the attempts that are in the future. Well, and last but certainly not least is response. Responses from a significant other have to be honest, they have to be timely, they have to be relevant, they have to be meaningful, and not have really any sort of hidden agenda. And while you notice that our model here separates these conditions in order to discuss each one, it's really essential to understand that there are no boundaries between the conditions. They don't work independently of one another, and they work in a synergistic way, in a holistic way. And when we do something that affects one condition, we affect them all in turn.
Yeah. And in our new book, we update this model of learning to include what we call 4 processes that empower learning. We won't spend a lot of time on them today, but they are additional processes that live alongside the conditions of learning in a classroom. This model of learning is how Deb and I think about creating a culture of learning. It reflects our value system that all children are made for learning. And being clear about our value system and theory allows us to explain our ideas rather than defend them, to clarify our thinking rather than protect it, and to expound on and illuminate our professional decision-making rather than simply complying with someone else's value system.
Okay, so now here's the fun part. Let's start looking at some classroom examples, right? Let's take that theory and let's look at practice, okay? So we're going to begin with a visit to a kindergarten classroom, okay? This classroom right here. And so here you see a teacher, Trish Candia, who was is still one of my dearest friends, and was one of the most open learners I think I've ever gotten to experience. She just invited me right into her classroom, into her learning space to study teaching. She was a second-year classroom teacher, and I had worked with her first year, and I was wanting to study in a classroom, and I said, hey, can I come, hang out in your classroom and watch what you're doing and think about it? And she was like, sure, come on. And so here we go. First day of kindergarten, we started together. So she is one of those just reflective human beings, and she brings that into her teaching. She's thoughtful, she's reflective, and she's very focused on her students. And one of the things I always appreciated was that she wants her students to love learning, and she also wants them to be truly kind human beings. So one of the things that she always would do is she taught to the heart as much as she taught to the intellect. And so the story I'm going to share comes from the very first day when I showed up in her classroom. I had worked with her the year before, but it's the first day of school. And here in the States, when school starts, first day, they all show up, and here we go. So she has this little group of 5-year-olds come into her classroom. And I just want to just share with you what happened on that first day. So it was the first day, and I was sitting in the back, just taking lots and lots and lots and lots of field notes, and also nurturing someone who was really having a hard time separating from family. So she's crying all day long. So I kind of wrote and patted the back, wrote and patted the back. This was a day. So here's what happened on the first day. This was our first day of school, day 1. Kids came in, and she had them come to the rug, and they sat down, in a little circle. And she said, okay, why do we come to school? And then she proceeded to answer her own question. She said, well, we come because we're going to learn to read, and we're going to learn to write, and we're going to learn to do math. And then she proceeded the rest of the day to teach all of these rules, because she said, to do these things, we need rules to help us learn to be the best learners that we can be. So through that day, She taught them a behavior chart. She taught them how to raise their hands to get attention. She taught them other ways to get attention, like if you need to go to the bathroom. She taught them how to, she said, how will I know if you're ready? Your body, your hands, your brain, you sit like a pretzel. She said, oh, we got these things we're going to do in the morning, and there's rules for going to the bathroom, and there's rules for lining up, and there's rules for walking in the line, and there's procedures for the library, and there's rules for the blanket. And you can see that's all before lunch. Then we learned the lunch procedures and then dismissal routines, because we kept revisiting the rest of these routines through the afternoon. And so at the end of the day, all the little kids, off they go back to home. And she and I sat down in these little tiny chairs, which there's only, little tiny chairs in this classroom. And, you were just kind of sort of like, we sprawled as much as you can sprawl in a teeny tiny chair. And I said, so how do you think the day went? And she sits there for a moment, and I'm not sure if she welled up to cry, but she took her face and she just buried it in her hands. And she said, it was just awful. And I said, well, what makes you say that? What makes you say it was so awful? And she said, all we did today was go over rules. She said, they're not even going to want to come back tomorrow. I said, well, I looked back over my notes. I said, you did go over a lot of rules. Yeah. And I knew her, as I said, I knew her from the year before. And what I knew was that she was having a lot of self-doubt. And that self-doubt was coming from the fact that there was a mismatch between what she wanted her students to feel and what she did on that day, right? There's a real mismatch. Now, she was doing exactly what we're taught to do as new teachers. You got to get classroom management down, right? And I knew that she had not planned this day herself. She planned with her colleagues. So this was a grade team plan. This is not a reflection of her. It's a reflection of like all these things she's been taught. It's a reflection of her class, her teammates. So it's kind of a reflection of that. So I knew that there was this mismatch between what I know she wanted and what happened. And what really happened that day was the message that got communicated was that rules and routines are the most important thing. Okay. And there's a mismatch here, because when I said to her, what do you wish you'd spent the day doing? Like, what do you wish today had been? And she didn't really even hesitate, because she said, I wish that they had understood that reading and writing is a joyful thing. It's going to be such a happy time for us this year. We're going to be doing all these things together. Oh, it's going to be a great year. And I said, yeah, look at the difference here, right? I mean, I'm saying to you, look at the difference here. Completely different objectives here that she's wanting. So I said to her at that point, I said, well, guess what? They're going to come back tomorrow. We can do a do-over. Let's just do over day one. Let's pretend that tomorrow's the first day of school, and let's plan a day that achieves your goal, your message. And so kids came in just like they did the first day. They all found their little name tags. They sat on the rug. Only today, she wrote her name on the board and she said, what would you like to know about me? What do you want to know? And they proceeded to ask her all those little 5-year-old questions of, do you have kids? Do you have a dog? What color is your dog? Tell me about your mom, do you have brothers and sisters? Like, they wanted to know all that same sort of stuff that we all do to get to know you stuff on, right? And she responded, and she didn't rush them. She kept saying, what do you want to know? What would you like? Anything else you want to know? And they had a little chat. And by the end of this day, they had read 3 picture books aloud together. They had read 1 big book, and they had read and sung 1 song chart. They created a class name chart, because now they were talking about all their names, and they were noticing the first letters, and they all organized their names on a chart all by the first letters, right? All the first A names went together and the B names went together. They had written a message together. So they had written a little sign to go on their door that said, welcome to, their class. They talked about every time they would get ready to transition to something else, like going to the, time for all of us to go to the bathroom or time for us to go to recess. She would say, what do you already know about this to make it go well? right? They all knew stuff. They've lived 5 whole years. They know all kinds of stuff about getting in lines, You don't cut in front of somebody because that's not nice. You don't push somebody. You don't put your hands on people. They knew all this stuff. And during the day, they sat at tables, and Trish put book baskets from the library on the table, and they read all these books about, they're organized by topics and authors. And she said, oh, turn and talk. What's your favorite part? Discuss your favorite parts. They're doing all this. They sang songs all day long. And every day, every time during that day when she could, she would notice these ways of being together. Like she would name things about, like, look how, like, when you're trying to get my attention, you raise your hand. So when we're together, I know that you've got something you want to share with all of us. Did you notice how everyone's looking at the person who's talking? Like, you're looking at me, but when, someone here was talking, you were looking at that speaker, and so they just noticed and named all of what was going on. So here was the thing. They've now had this beautiful day, and those kids were engaged all day long because the learning and the teaching were aligned. Every decision she made in this day, in this do-over day, invited the students to be part of this community of learners, not because she was trying to control them. So classroom management's happening, right? But she's valued this way of teaching and learning.
Mm. And while this example is an example from kindergarten, the idea of creating a learning culture applies to all grades and all ages of learners. So how does one go about creating a, quote, learning culture? Classrooms are complex, busy settings with lots of things happening at once. How does one organise all this complexity to make it manageable? My research with Aussie and US teachers who create effective learning cultures show that they organise and plan their classroom practice under 4 categories of teaching decision. While the teachers didn't use these terms at the time, these are what emerged as patterns from the notes I took as I observed their practices. Space and time. This includes the daily schedules and physical environments in those classrooms. Routines and behaviours. These are expected ways of behaving and interacting together in those environments. Materials and resources. These refer to the inanimate physical paraphernalia that are essential for a lesson to work. They have to align with the space and time and routine and behaviour. Teacher thinking and language. This category is sometimes the most obvious in a classroom setting, and it can dominate it. But what and how teachers use language communicates how they want kids to behave and interact, how to do this, and how they believe kids should think and talk in the classroom. We will show you several examples of each of these in action in this session. What appears on this slide are just some of the ways Trish's do-over day 1 that we noted the categories, the instructional examples, and the conditions of learning are related. This is how teachers can use this theory of learning to guide their practice.
So the first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is space and time. All right, so as you can see here, the way Trish organized her library by author and topics supports the students to be self-directed when they practice and employ what they're learning. And with these multiple texts that she read during read aloud and shared reading, she provided a lot of opportunities to demonstrate literacy behaviors that the students are learning. Okay, so the conditions of employment and demonstration were really lifted up in the way that she designed the day.
These examples Deb has drawn your attention to are examples of the relationship between space and time and the conditions of demonstration and employment. The way a teacher sets up the environment and how they choose to use time is crucial to how successful a learning setting will be.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about routines and behaviors. So Trish sets up the kids to notice ways of being together, right? And to be curious about their environment, what's occurring in that environment. And she also takes the time to notice and name what they're doing that are examples of how they're learning together, right? And through these interactions, she communicates her belief that they're capable of doing this kind of thinking and learning together.
These examples Deb has drawn your attention to illustrate how teacher expectations influence teacher responses. These might be quite new ways of being together for students. This is a significant change of culture for many classrooms. This kind of learning setting is a good platform for implementing the conditions.
Okay, and so next is materials and resources. So Trisha's really aware of how to support the kids to construct the classroom together, through using quality texts and through creating artifacts like the class name chart that enrich the environment. And ultimately, those texts become another source of demonstration and immersion.
Yep, the conditions of immersion and demonstration underpin these examples. The multiple texts immerse them in book language, and the wall charts and messages created together become a resource to guide their current reading or writing task or other behaviours. In my research, we found the way the kids use wall print changes as they become more secure in what they understand. When using the wall print to help them with things such as conventional spelling, kids attend to it less and less as they internalize what is being learned.
And then finally, to look at the teacher thinking and language. Throughout this whole do-over day, Trisha's language was invitational, okay, rather than directional. On the first day, it was directional. It was like, let me tell you what to do. Today, on this do-over day, it's invitational. She's asking the students to notice ways of being together, things that they're already using, and she's communicating her expectations and her beliefs in their capabilities. And when she asked the students what they wanted to know about her, she's framing curiosity as a real desirable way for the kids to make approximations, which she in turn honors as a way of learning.
Formulario.
And also what is embedded in Trisha's language are her expectations that kids are capable of doing this, of taking control and participating, and their responses will be honoured and celebrated rather than evaluated. It says to the kids that what they want to share is valued and of interest. Why we do the things in the way we do really matters tremendously.
Okay, so why don't we pause right there and come on, I'll stop sharing, and let's have you go into some breakout rooms and just give you a few moments just to kind of process what you're hearing and talk about that. So let me just take a moment here, and we have about 70 people here. So let's see. Here we go. And I think it will automatically take you over to breakout rooms, right? Okay. And enjoy your conversations. Let's see. We'll put you in for maybe about 5 minutes or so. Does that sound good? There'll be 5 minutes to have conversation, and then a timer will count down 30 seconds to give you a chance to wrap up your last thought. So enjoy the conversation with your colleagues.
Thank you.
Yeah, suddenly it came back, Hugo. Let's see. So let me
You
pause.
did put me in one of them?
Take I would often take a full hour of a lecture to model how I would write an essay. Thinking out loud, staring at the roof, pondering, writing things on the board, crossing them out. And I think you're right. I don't think we, at university level, bother to give those kinds of demonstrations. My students found them most useful.
Yeah. It really is. It's amazing how we forget, like we drop into tell mode, like we just tell everything, right? As opposed to show. And how many of us, it's like, someone please show me how to do things. And I think that's so valuable. It doesn't matter what age you are, whether you're demonstrating for little ones or you're demonstrating for tall people,
Yes,
right?
yes,
It's the same
yes.
thing. Yeah. All right. So we're going to move in and now watch some video of some little kiddos. And so we kind of zoomed in and just pulled out some video of some kids that we thought would be just adorable and engaging. So we that was part of our criteria, was thinking about let's take a look at kids who are doing this learning. So we pull our slides up here. We were here with the why we do things and the way we do, and we have 2 more breakouts. So each of these video clips you see, we're going to put you into a breakout so that you have an opportunity to to talk about that. So whoops, let me pull this back here and just do a little bit of background on who you're going to see here. So it's a group of kids, and again, they're some 5-year-olds, and you're going to see them first in a whole group setting with a lesson, and then we're going to show you a video clip of a few of them that I pulled into a small group to do some work with. And so just kind of be thinking about what you notice about them. They're reading a book in both of these lessons, a book that they had seen multiple times, a little book big book called In the Fairy Tale Woods. And it's one of those, adorable little books that takes fairy tale characters that many of the children knew, especially if they're watching Disney, they know these characters. And it has, the rhyme, rhythm, repetition that supports these young learners to be able to hold on to the text language. It also has a repetitive phrase, look in and out and here and there, look up and down and everywhere. And that is on every single page in the book. And so there'll be a 2-page spread like this, and some of those little characters at the bottom where you can find them. And then here's the Cinderella page, which the kids were just enthralled with. And so you find and locate, and it offers kids a lot of opportunity to talk about their thinking, and also to use language to talk about where they find these characters up in this illustration. So as you watch this video clip, just notice about any decisions that you notice that I'm making to create classroom culture, and how these decisions affect the conditions of learning. Now, I should give you a heads up, because sometimes there's a dissonance, and I think it's jarring. When you watch this lesson, you will notice that the teacher, who is me, has long dark hair. Okay, so this is pre-COVID. So my hair now is my COVID going forward hair color and cut. So just take notes as you watch about things that you're thinking about the students, and be prepared to share your thinking with your colleagues in a breakout. So here we go with our students. Let me just make sure I have sound, and I did share sound. So here we go.
We've been reading In the Fairy Tale Woods. So before we read our new book, let's go back in and let's talk a little bit more about this book, because there was lots and lots and lots of things to talk about in here. So we talked a lot about the Cinderella page. Should we go to the Cinderella page again? Yeah. Or should we go to Little Red Riding Hood? Yeah. Little Red Riding Hood? All right, so let me go in. I'm going to find the Little Red book. So I'm looking in, taking a look through, and here is Little Red Riding Hood. Here's her page. So these pages are all about Little Red Riding Hood. So it says, a little girl with a big red hood, what must she find in the dark, dark woods? And this was your part. You ready? Look in and out and here and there. Look up and down and everywhere. All right, so now here's our key at the bottom. So we're going to see if we can find all these different things from the Little Red Riding Hood story. And remember, we were practicing using our words to help other people to see what we see. So let's see, how about we look for lumberjack? Should we look for him? Okay, David, can you come up, stand right here beside, and give us some words on how to find the lumberjack? So you're telling them with words where to look. The lumberjack.
The lumberjack is walking down in the hill.
The lumberjack is walking down the hill, down the path. Yeah. What other words could describe? Thank you, David. Go ahead and say. What else? What other words could you use to describe? Gavin, tell us what else we could say about the lumberjack.
Walking.
Can you tell us where? Give us some of those words like in and out and on and up and down.
Up the tree.
The lumberjack is walking
Up the tree.
kind of up by the tree. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gavin. All right. What about the flowers? Who can talk about where the flowers are? You want to give it a go, Astrid? So Astrid's going to tell us about the flowers.
The flowers are beside the tree.
The flowers are beside the tree. They are, aren't they? And we knew right where to look. What else could you say about the flowers? Give it a go, Chelsea.
The flowers are on the bushes.
Yep, right here on the bushes. Anything else? What else could you say, Enrique?
The flowers are next to the tree.
Flowers are next to the tree, aren't they? Yes, look at that. What about the wolf? What could we say here? You want to give it a go, Cindy? Tell us about the wolf who's dressed up like Grandma. Yes, trying to fool Little Red Riding Hood.
The wolf is behind the tree.
Look, the wolf is behind the tree. And how could we tell people know which tree? Remember how we put the color?
The bright purple tree.
Yeah, could you put all that into one big idea sentence?
The wolf is behind the tree, but he's holding a bright purple tree.
He is holding it, isn't he? All right, look at that.
Okay, so let's have you think about what intrigued you in the lesson. What did you notice about any decisions that I was making to create classroom culture? And how did those decisions affect the student learning? So let me pause the sharing right here and put you into those breakout rooms. Enjoy your conversations. You should have, let's see, let me open the rooms. You'll have the 5 minutes again. Just jump in and have a quick conversation.
Once again.
Yeah, Rich, you get right in the middle of a sentence. Oh, the breakouts are never long enough. You know, I'm like, we could make them longer. I don't know if we have enough time again. Anyone want to come off their mute and just share some of the thinking, anything that they were noticing or something they want to talk about?
I could. Well,
Just jump right in. Yeah, jump right in.
Lily and I were talking about, like, well, in the overall, we discussed a few things, but in the overall, we were saying, look, what we are seeing in the space in the overall is we need to guide our practices. Our practices need to be based, or our decisions we make in terms of our practices as teachers, on theory, right? In concepts. We need to be aware of why we do what we do. You know, so decisions that are guided by theory, actually, that make it can lead to more meaningful outcomes in terms of what we expect our learners or learners are expected to, you know, to build, to construct. And one of the things that we mentioned there is that, for example, in the video, when you actually started the lesson, or this part of the lesson that you showed us, you started by posing a question. And that question that you were posing somehow led or allowed the students to, in a way, make decisions about what was about to happen. Do you want us to focus on this part or that part? This character or that other. I mean, you in a way empower students into what was going to happen in that space. And that is one way to raise that condition of responsibility. Something as subtle as subtle as just asking a question
Mhm.
on
Mhm.
which way you want us to go. There are moments, and we were saying, in which we teachers need to somehow take control of what's happening. Of course, that's what we prepare for. That's why we go to university, because we are aware of what is that we need to be led and lead into. But there are moments in which very subtle actions, such as, for example, asking a question just to open up the space, can really provide students to feel empowered and to feel that they're making decisions into what's about to happen. And I think as again, we said, it's subtle. It seems like nothing. It seems like even silly. Just asking that you want to focus on this one and that one. But when you make this systematic and constant throughout your teaching practices, you are actually giving them the possibility to be responsible, as the responsibility as the condition is stated, for what's going to happen there. And that is one of the conditions of learning.
Yeah, anytime you can offer kids a choice, because it really didn't matter which page we were on. It didn't make one bit of difference what page you were on. The same kind of language was going to be happening. And that was the, this was about extending language. They had read this book several times. And sometimes people will ask, well, how could the kids like suddenly have that language? Well, the first time we read the book, you know how they were coming up to the book. The first time we read it, they came up and they just pointed, because they didn't always have the language. And so if they had language, that was great. But if they didn't, then I would say, oh, Cinderella is beside the tree, right? So then the second day, they came up, they would show, and I say, can you say that with words? And I'd help a little bit. So this is about 4 or 5 days of doing this together, right? It's multiple days, multiple demonstrations, but each time they're taking on just a little bit more. And so again, if I can offer them choice and say, which one do you want to talk about? Doesn't really matter. Anything you want to say about that, Brian?
Well, it's amazing what can happen when students interact with a text and with other students in a learning culture that supports them. If we look more closely at some of the decisions that create that classroom culture, I think it would be interesting.
All right, so let me pull this PowerPoint slide up that will get us to some of the thinking that we put onto our slide here about this lesson. So let me pull that up, Brian. Let's see. Whoops, did I get the right? Hold on, let me make sure I got in the right space. So we're going to unpack it through the same space-time routines and behaviors, materials, resources, and so on. So let's see here. So here was the first thing that we talked about: the space and the time, right? And devoting the time to a lesson. Whoops, you know what I'm realizing? I don't think I shared screen. I'm just talking away to my slide. I was just talking away to my slide. There we go. All by myself. Hold on. Here we go. Now we go.
Yeah.
I'm getting better at Zoom. You'd think a year and a half in, I would kind of have this down, but you know how it is. Every now and then you just think, do I really have a clue how Zoom works? Okay. So thinking about these different pieces here. So as Brian was saying, the space and time. Yeah. Brian, do you want to say anything about space and time before I share anything here?
Well, space and time, they are things, aspects of a classroom that a teacher has a limited number of, or every classroom has space that has to be filled and time that has to be filled. And the way that you organize space and the way that you distribute yourself across time should really reflect your values and beliefs about how effective learning occurs. So if you believe that it's important for kids to interact and talk with each other, then you're going to organize your desks in ways that almost make it impossible for kids not to talk to each other. When I first began teaching, the common practice was that kids sat in alphabetical order, one to a desk, and the very smartest kids sat at the front of the room, and then you worked down through the various levels till you got to the last desk in the last row, and that was the dumbest kid in the room. And of course, that gave lots of different messages to different kids. So how you organize that space really has to be commensurate with your values about how learning occurs. So how you organize your desks, how you organize your books, how you organize where kids keep things and put them away. And the same for time. You have a limited amount of time. How are you going to use that time in ways that enables kids to create meaning using language that is meaningful and relevant to what your lesson is about?
And I'm going to uncover the second one because I think these really, they run into each other a lot. Like in terms of, devoting time to a lesson that is really about just giving kids a chance to talk. I mean, that is such a powerful reason to have language occurring, right? Or spend your time so that kids are able to express that language. And one of the things too that's important that really has to do with materials and resources, but also about space and time and routines and behaviors is reusing text, like doing a lot of thinking about text that kids have already had some thinking about, and recognizing that over time, they are going to deepen their understandings because they keep returning to that text. A lot of times it's about, do we give kids harder text? And I find that kids are more successful if they're returning to text and thinking more and more about it. So, inviting the kids in as a routine and a behavior where they can come in, and the more that they own some of that text, they can come in and, read those repetitive parts. But I mean, you see all of those conditions of learning that are being supported just in the way that you organize your space, time, your routines and behaviors and material and resources. And then lastly, that teacher thinking and language, knowing that the lesson purpose is extending oral language, that was what I was going for. And then just creating a lesson that offers kids the opportunity to do that. And asking them, say more about that. And so this was just some of the languages as we watched the video, we just tried to capture some of the language, like remember we're practicing using our words. What other words could we use? So that kids are learning that language is very flexible, right? There's many different ways that you can say the same thing. Who can come and talk about? And then, kids give us little bits and little bits, helping them. Can you put those ideas into one sentence? Could you put those all together? Right? So you're asking them to combine ideas into a big sentence, having a go, tell us with words, those are all kinds of ways that we're supporting, language develop. And this is a quote from the book where we just talk about that there's nothing incidental.
A la una me tenía que preparar algo, mira, la hora de acordarme.
So nothing incidental nor accidental about the choices that teachers make as they expose students to high quality literacy materials and authentic literacy experiences, and then craft that instruction based on what students are needing for their learning. So we are up to another little lesson here. So we're going to see another little group of kids, same group of kids, but in a small group setting. So we're coming back and giving them the opportunity to say more, because sometimes kids don't have enough opportunity to share their thinking. So what we'll do is take a look at this same group of kids, again, noticing teaching decisions, how they affect the conditions, and take some notes and be prepared to share your thinking with your colleagues in your breakout room. Okay, so here we go with this little group.
So we're going to read and talk some more about this book, okay? Give you a chance to think. Do you remember some of these characters that are in the story?
Jack. Little Red Riding Hood. Piggy. The three little piggies. Goldilocks. And Little Red Riding Hood.
All right, so sit back so I can open the book up. Sit back on your bottom and let's open the book up. In the Fairy Tale Woods. All right. Can you spy with your little eye fairy tale characters passing by? And then this was your part completely. Look in.
Out and near.
here and there.
Look up and down and everywhere.
There it is. So it tells us, can you find? So think about which character you want to find Cinderella. Start us off, Genesis. Can you tell us with words where she
Cinderella
is?
is behind the yellow tree. Brownish and yellow tree.
There she is.
Snow White.
Yeah.
Jack.
Can you find Snow White, Astrid? Tell us where she is.
Snow White is in top of the little hill.
Snow White is on
Jack.
top of the hill.
Sitting.
What other words
Jack.
could we use to talk about where Snow White is?
Goldilocks.
What else could you say?
Jack.
Hold on a minute. Let's talk a little bit more about Snow White.
Snow White is sitting in the yellow little hill.
Yeah. What else can we say about where Snow White is? Tell us what else we could say, David.
Snow White is on the littlest tree on the little mountain.
She's on that little hill, that little mountain. And what is she with the tree? What did you say with the tree?
Brownish tree. The brownish tree.
Tell us your whole idea, David.
Snow White is on the littlest tree behind the brownish tree.
Yeah. Are you ready, Delilah? Tell us somebody that you would like to look for in the picture.
Hey!
Which one are you looking for?
Little Red Riding Hood.
Tell us about Little Red Riding Hood.
She is up the big hill.
Yep, she's up
The
the
big
big hill. What else can we say about
Jack.
Little Red Riding Hood? What could you say about Little Red? So let's talk about Little Red Riding Hood for a second. Where is she? What else could we say where she is?
Little Red Riding Hood is up in the big hill.
Chill. Yeah. What else could we say?
Jack.
What could we say about the grass? Could we add the grass into our thinking?
Yeah.
How can we?
Little Red Riding Hood is on the big giant the big giant mountain with the green grass.
You added it into the thinking, so that tells us even more specifically where she is. Who? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Genesis.
Little Red Riding Hood is standing in the green grass on the big hill.
Look at all those different ways we can say our same idea. Wow.
So
Should we
I'll
read
pause us
another
right
page?
there and give you some time to talk about, again, what intrigued you in the lesson, things you were noticing, and how those decisions were affecting student learning. So I'll put you into your breakouts, and here we go.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think it's still putting people into breakouts. Okay, let's see. Not sure what's deleting some people. So Brian, we are to that part where it says, let's explore the classroom culture we saw in the video in red on page 12. That's where we're up to, because we had to just process through those.
What slide number?
So we'll discuss the slide that has the bars on it for this one. So we'll come back to that one.
Is that slide 34 or 33?
Yes, slide 34.
Okay, I know where I'm up to now.
Yeah, so we'll come back.
Let's explore the classroom culture. Is that right?
So, yeah. Yeah. So we'll come back to that one. And instead of having people talk out this time, we'll just go straight to those slides, and then we'll finish up, and then we'll have the breakout at the conversation time at the end.
Okay.
So we'll just discuss the 4 on the slide Do you want me to discuss that really quickly and then we'll go on into the ending piece?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For some reason, your screen went a little blurry.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, your screen's gone. Like half of your screen now, it looks like. Yeah, when you move over there, it's not blurry. Maybe undo your background and try it one more time, or put it back on and see if that.
Undo the background.
Yeah, take that off and let's see if that helps any.
Choose virtual background. None.
No, it's still got a blurriness to it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's going on. That's okay. We can still see and tell that it's you. It's not as clear as it was before you started.
Yeah, it looks like could be a bit of dirt on the camera.
I had to do that when I went somewhere to record, and the tech people came in and they were like rolling their eyes at me and cleaning my screen because it was not clean, because I never remember to clean my screen. So yeah, so we'll do a quick little ending, and that gives everybody time to ask questions here at the end. So Brian, when I finish with slide number 36, you will, let's see, 30, 35, 36, and then you'll start talking while we're still on slide 36. And then a little bit later we're to 37. So we talk a little bit about things, and then then we'll go into it. Okay, so everyone's back. Here we go. So we're going to go ahead and talk through a little bit of thinking around that video, and then wrap our session up, because we want to make sure that we have time for questions and answers at the end. Because we could talk all day, I have a feeling here. So when we think about this, Brian, you want to say a little bit before we go to the slide?
Well, I think it would be a good idea to explore the classroom culture we saw in the video. And what appears on this slide are just some of the ways that we noted the categories, the instructional examples, and how the conditions of learning are related. Again, this shows how teachers can use the conditions of learning to guide their practice. So just kind of briefly, because you see some of the similar things here, you saw the kids here were, the way I used the space, I had them seated in that semicircle, because when they're in a circle or a semicircle, they can listen more easily to each other. And so one of the things, again, we wanted to make sure was that they were expected to be listening to what each of them was saying. So again, there were multiple lessons prior to this, but it gave them an opportunity to think about language. And if you notice, I was the one doing the pointing now. We've moved from they pointed and I talked to them talking to now just kind of reinforcing and noticing and pointing into the book after they share their idea, but offering them a lot of responsibility to share their thinking. And then as we were reading on there, just withdrawing my voice so that they can continue on, was again, it just gives them the opportunity to try things out, take responsibility.
And then all the way through, using their names, because I think that sends such a message to kids that we're honoring who they are. And again, using a known text, the kids are comfortable. They're a lot more comfortable coming into that conversation than they were on the first day. So that really brings engagement up because they're confident. They see themselves as learners. They know what we're doing. They know how this works. And again, a lot of that same kind of language that you saw in the other video. What else can we say? Can you put your ideas into one sentence? What are you thinking? Those are the kind of language that we can use that really does support kids to recognize how much we value them as learners. It's the kind of response that ties in with expectation to communicate that belief that you have in those learners. It's that kind of teaching that gives kids that space for thinking.
Yeah, and in the clip, it all seems so natural and spontaneous. I really think you've had to spend a lot of time thinking about beliefs and values, or as we term in our book, theory, and how it can be put into practice in contexts such as these. How and where did you learn to do that, Deb?
Well, in my pre-service takeaways, one of the things that I think was really important was that just that notion that you have to figure out what kids are doing, what they can do. That notion that Yetta Goodman calls kid watching has to be part of your practice. And it can't be looking for all the things they can't do, right? You can't be looking for the gaps or what they can't do. You've got to find what they can do, because what that's going to do is then also help you to understand the expectations that they have for themselves and the approximations that they're making. Because I've got to be able to see what they have under control, as well as the kinds of approximations. And the first principle that Brian names for engagement is that learners have to see themselves as doers. Well, as the teacher, I have to see them as doers as well, right? I have to have the expectation and see that what they're doing is powerful, because that has to permeate every interaction that I have with them, because every other decision that you make as a teacher flows off of that. And so one of the key ideas in our book is that the teacher's role is to support meaning making. It is not to transfer what I know to the learner, right? Teaching is a response to learning. It's not the starting point. And so my belief about learners is embedded in this idea. And one of the things that you have to do as a teacher, as you get out there, is you have to learn to find your voice, right? You have to learn to articulate your beliefs, because not everybody is going to want to teach the way you teach. I mean, I was sort of that, the rogue person at my school trying out, I was wanting to try and learn and do different things. And in my student teaching experience, it was so funny. I had two different placements, and my second grade teacher mentor was brilliant. She offered me lots of opportunities to make decisions that were really important. But the kindergarten mentor that I had, she and her planning partner spent a lot of time selecting which worksheets to use. That was what they would get together. It's like, if we're teaching the number 5, they would say, okay, do you want to use this worksheet or that worksheet? And I'm sitting there in there, going, okay, at the university, they were telling us we're supposed to be doing this, but this is not what y'all are doing. And so when it was time for me to be observed by someone from the university, I asked this little wonder if question. And I do this a lot when I work with teachers and now, and I just find that I do this as I'm coaching, is I said to them, do you think it would be okay if I created some math centers for the kids to use during my lesson observation? Because that's kind of what they're talking to us about at the university, and I really would like to try that out. And so here are these two experienced teachers who look at each other and kind of raise their eyebrows, and they're thinking, look at this young teacher who has no clue what she's talking about. Sure, you go right on ahead, right? Like they're humoring me. And what I have to say is that it went really well. And the teacher herself said, the kids were really engaged. They were really liking this. Maybe I should try some of those kinds of things. And I thought, what a lovely experience as a teacher, a student teacher, to be trying out some things and having a teacher say that to me. So one of the things that I'm always aware of is that you have to be willing to put yourself out there and try things, because it is never going to go well the first time, and it's never going to go well probably the second and the fourth and the 10th time. But when that alignment is there with your belief, over time your approximations get closer. So while it's scary to try new things, the only way you learn is to give it a go and make approximations.
It's a good example of aligning theory and practice, and using a "what do you think" question doesn't deny your mentor's experience and knowledge. You're not offending by being an uppity student. You're being a learner who is willing to approximate. So let me close. As a teacher, your goals drive the decisions on what and how you will help your students learn. These goals, in turn, are based on your beliefs, or what Deborah and I call theory, about learning and how it works. As a new teacher, you should take time to develop a consistent theory which can provide you with a framework for guiding your teaching decisions. As we said earlier, we believe teaching is a response to learning, not vice versa. And our role as teachers is to provide a learning setting which supports this belief. If you find this perspective compelling, we encourage you to consider the theory you see embedded in this visual as a framework. It can help you make sense of the complexities of what you see and hear during your classroom experiences. And as we've shown through the examples we've shared today, this is what using a theory of learning to shape instruction is all about. Using a vision of what is possible to guide the day-to-day decisions that we make. This approach to making teaching decisions we take in our book. And at its core, creating a classroom learning culture that is as uncomplicated and barrier-free as possible is important, especially for students who've been marginalized by poverty, ethnicity, and negative stereotyping. Maintaining democracy as we know it depends on a school system which produces a citizenry of critically literate graduates. Given the current threats to democracy, we need to ensure that every student becomes a critically literate citizen. Here is our book, which expands on the thinking we shared today. It's available from Richard Owen. We have some time for questions, so tell us, what are you thinking?
Well, thank you very much, Debra, Brian, Richard, for this enriching space. Thank you for spending this time with us, allowing us to come closer to the work, to your work. So we open up the space for questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and you may ask your question. I'm going to invite you to turn on, obviously, your microphone, but also your camera as you pose your question. Jose Vicente, you raise your hand. So please go right ahead, Jose Vicente.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to thank you for sharing this wonderful theory with us. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I think one of the wonderful things that I notice is that the application goes beyond the elementary level, because literacy, we can definitely understand literacy in a broad perspective, and we continue to learn what it is to read and write. I think, in these explorations of literacy, especially at the university level, some scholars have come up with this idea that we cannot take for granted or assume that students already know everything there is to know. about reading and writing. We keep learning about these things and about reading and writing the entire world because there are so many languages. I love the part when you shared your experience as a student teacher, because I think that's another form of literacy, learning to be a teacher and creating, coming up with your own theories. And I think it's fantastic. How can you let your student teachers make those approximations into what it means to teach, but at the same time, let them build their own theories and validate those theories? Could you maybe, do you think that that's fine? What would be your, I don't know, your take on this learning to teach as another form of literacy?
Brian, do you want to talk to that, or you want me to start?
You start, Deb. I need to think a little bit. It's a good question.
It is. Well, I think, I think one of the things that, like, I know in probably the last 5 or 6 years, just in my own work, is that expanding the notion of what language involves, of expanding the notion of what texts are, like recognizing that, texts are not just books and words, it's art, it's music, it's, sign language, it's everything. And so the more that we help children learn, as you were saying, that notion of reading the world, how powerful that is. And when you're learning to teach, if you see that your role is in so many ways, like, it's almost like you're a docent at a museum, right? It's like, a lot of stuff, and you may be drawing attention to things, but you're pausing and you're allowing for the processing, and you're just saying, what do you all think about that? I mean, I'm sort of a broken record when I'm working with kids or even adults, is, the question that I'm always saying is, what are you thinking? Oh, what makes you think that? Oh, does anybody else want to jump on, think about more about that? Because I think when you view that we're all constructing meaning as the base of everything, then you begin to teach very differently. Like when you don't see yourself as the one who's like sitting there with, I've got it figured out, I know what I'm doing, I can do this. That's such a different stance as a learner. Yeah. Brian, what are you thinking over there?
Well, one of the last research studies that I did before I retired was with a group of teachers who wanted to create a learning climate, a classroom ethos, if you like, that supported the conditions of learning. And I suggested that they needed to really examine the language that they used in the classroom, because previously we'd read Peter Johnson's book on, I forget what he called it now, but it was a marvelous little book on
choice
the
words,
language
or
that teachers use. Which one was that?
Open choice words. Yeah.
Choice words. Yeah. And so I had this small group of teachers who said, yes, we really want to change the culture of our classroom, and we think your idea of changing language would be a good way to do it. So I said, well, let's start with something simple. You know how many teachers describe the activities that you are expecting kids to do as work, W-O-R-K? What kind of message does that give to the kids in your classroom? And they thought for a while, and they said, oh, well, it implies that learning is a chore, like washing the dishes at home or doing the garden, something you have to do. And over again, we keep saying to our students, good work, get on with your work. If you work really hard today, I'll let you have an early mark. So I suggested to this group of teachers that they try to go through a lesson without using the word work. And they said, oh, easy peasy, we can do that. So they tried. And the next time I met with them, they all said 10 minutes into the lesson, I couldn't avoid it. I could not avoid using that word work. It was very hard. I had to be consciously aware of every word that I was using. And I said, yes, that's what you need to do if you want to change the culture of your classroom. If you want the kids in your class to use the same language as you have to choose your language very carefully. And so we then began to experiment with things like, instead of saying, today we're going to learn about biology, why not try saying, today we are going to make meaning using some ideas from biology. Today we're going to make meaning using mathematical symbols. And it's quite surprising that once they got into the habit of doing this, then the kids themselves started to use the same language. And that was the indicator that the culture of the classroom was changing the way that the teachers wanted it to change. So, you know, my short answer is look at your own language very carefully. Think of the messages that are embedded subtly in your language that you're probably not consciously aware of, and then try to get the kids to use the same kind of language. And once they start doing it, as they did in one of Deborah's little videos there, I noticed they began to use some of Deborah's words. That's the indicator that they're starting to understand how the classroom culture is supposed to work. Not easy. It was trying.
But we
I
aren't
still
there.
use the word work. I have a hard time not using that word. So every time I use it, though, it's kind of like a twitch now because Brian's made me so aware of it. So.
Thank you, Jose, for your question as a way to keep on expanding our understanding and reflections, you know, out of what Debra and Dr. Brian have shared with us. Juan Carlos Guerra, Professor Juan Carlos Guerra, you raise your hand. Please go right ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for having this wonderful opportunity. I'm really excited. I have been sharing in the breakout rooms, and it's kind of hard to be, you know, pulled out of the room like in this time. That's kind of awful. But what I wanted to say is first, thinking about what Debra said about sounding like a broken record. I think it's wonderful when you understand that making meaning is the whole thing that you're about. Mm-hmm. So because this happens all the time. You ask the same question, you want students to participate, and there's a moment in which they realize that what you want to do is to construct, build together knowledge. So I think that's very important for all of us. And when I think about beliefs, and this is connected to the videos, to the activities that we did together, is related to how we create or construct our principles interacting with our students. For example, I love reading. My passion is children's literature, and that's part of what I do in my classes with my students all the time. And you know, this is something that I learned when I was working with the Freemans and the Goodmans in the United States, and it was wonderful to come to class and do stuff similar to the one that you are doing. But here in our country, I was asking one of the students in the room, I was asking her, how many big books do you have in your classroom? What is the quality of those big books? Because in the videos, the kids were, you know, enjoying it so much because there was rhyme, there was music. The material the material has quality. So I think that for us it's important to keep thinking about our principles and how those principles are constructed or discovered or revealed in our classes. You cannot wait to finish your program and go to the practicum to discover what reading is. So I think it is important that we keep thinking about that, because all the time we're like, for example, you were talking and you were doing the activities that you were sharing in the videos. And I remember when Brian was here, and he has used this in his test several times, those stages in where the teacher does and the students observe, then the teacher does and the students help, then the students help and the teacher, the students do and the teachers help, and finally the students do and the teachers observe. It sounds so simple, but I mean, to give some flesh to that, it takes time, it takes discussions, it takes lots of things. So this is an invitation for our students here, because the main concern in Colombia, and this is something that I can share from my experience, is that students are constantly asking that the theory of the conditions for literacy learning cannot be applied in our context because we don't have the context. We are not immersed in the context. So they're like, and also they're thinking that learning a second language is completely different from learning the first language. So this is a big issue here. We are all the time we're thinking, okay, what can we do? Because you talk about routines, you talk about rituals, you talk about many different things, and those things needed to be explored, developed with our students, because the first thing that we have to do is like, how do we overcome that idea that is not possible? They tell you, no, immersion, what immersion? We cannot have immersion. We're in Colombia. And then, teachers go the other way around and say, of course, we can do immersion. How do we do it? Arts, literature, play. That's what we have to do in our classes, right? And we can take these not only to the young ones, we can take these to teachers, because that's what we need to do with teachers. We want them to teach in a particular way or discover their own beliefs. That's what we need to do. Work with them and discover together. Thank you very much again.
I dropped my website into the chat box because there's a lot of video on there of kids all the way up. I think the oldest kids on there are at the end of their 5th grade of school. So they would be 12, I think, 12 maybe. And so there's a lot of video on there, and you don't need any permissions or passwords or, I'm like, I don't want to know anybody's information, but it's all on there. So if you want to take a look at any of it, yeah. Any last questions or wonders? So we're kind of wrapping up towards the end.
Unfortunately, time is never enough, right? There are always things that are going to be left up in the air, and discussions and questions that we would like to bring about, right? Professor Marlon Vanegas, you raised your hand before, you put it back down. I don't know if you still want to answer.
Yes, I don't know if we're going to have enough time, but I would like to listen. Yes, it was something that I think you was hoping when we were talking about the condition that has to do with response. But my issue here, when I was last watching the videos, yes, I want to invite you to let us know about, I know I once read the book Brian wrote about alternative assessment, but is it what you can tell us about assessing or evaluating this process in preschool especially? Yes. I don't know what is it that maybe you have to expand in regard to the experience you just shared with us today with those videos.
So thinking about how we would assess our learners in that way. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. So I talk with teachers about this a lot. You know, it's the biggest challenge sometimes because we fall into. Do you have grading issues? Do you have to give kids grades in your schools? Yeah. There's always that big push and pull about how do I know what kids are learning, and then how do I convert it into a grade? So I'm having these conversations right now with the school I'm working with. So I think one of the things you have to, as a teacher, learn and internalize is what you're looking for. Like, what does it mean when students are thinking well? Like, what do they do? What are those reading behaviors that they're going to use and exhibit? So part of it for me, I know as a teacher, is recognizing what I'm looking for. So, you know, that I think has to be something that you continually study. I mean, that is not something that, and I'm still learning this like years and years into my practice. But like reading the people who talk about like what reading behaviors to look for along a continuum, looking at language along a continuum, you know, looking at math along a continuum, that I think that's a big concept that I had to wrap my brain around, that learning is not a checklist and you either got it or you don't, that it's a continuum, and that you can always have things that are that'll be very sort of firm. So like when I look at things, I think about, is that behavior firm right now? Is it being approximated? But it's knowing the behaviors. So look, you know, using some type of a reading development continuum, or reading a writing continuum of some sort that helps you to know what to look for. And then that's the kind of thing, like for me, having it on a clipboard in my classroom so that as I'm watching kids, I've got something that's a reference for me. And it just helps me to learn what to look for. And then as I'm looking at what I'm seeing, I can like determine, like, is this something that kids that they're doing that's working really well for them? What do they have under control? And then recognizing that when the complexity of the task or the book increases, then quite often what was firm is now more in the approximation category. Like it's recognizing that learning is a like it's not static. You know, it's a very dynamic process. It's also a very dynamic expectation of for how kids learn. I don't know if I answered that well enough, or kind of the direction you were going.
Yes,
one of the
because
things that
in the concept of learning, you
talk about in our book are
sorry.
processes that empower learning. And to me, the process that we call transformation is probably the most valid and important assessment that I would ever use in a classroom. And by transformation, I mean that when a student takes what has been demonstrated and then expands it, adds to it, uses it, and makes it his own, rather than just regurgitate what I've demonstrated, they show me in very subtle ways how they can take that information, take those demonstrations, and use them in ways that I've never demonstrated, but which show that they have really internalized and are making connections to the real world. One of the best examples I can think of is I once worked with a teacher who was about 6th grade, who was studying what was it? She was studying fairy tales, and the kids were being immersed in fairy tales, and then not fairy tales, they were fables. The kids were being immersed in fables. She read Aesop's fables to them, and she read other famous writers of fables, and they looked at the morals, one good turn deserves another. And then during the discussion, she asked them, is there another possible moral that could come out of this fable that we've been studying? And when those kids could come up with a fable that was equally as applicable to the original one, then that to me was an indication that they were transforming what they'd been learning into something new and extending it. And I can remember another teacher who who gave the kids the task of studying nursery rhymes and making sense of them. And one little kid who was really smart and intelligent, he began to rewrite them in his own language. And I can remember one that he came up with was, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He said, my rewriting of this is scintillate, scintillate, diminutive asteroid. How I wonder at your amazing abilities. For 3 blind mice, he wrote, a trio of myopic rodents all ran after the bucolic spouse who severed their rear appendices with a kitchen cutting utensil. Have you ever seen anything like that in the term of your natural life? Now, he was a very smart kid, way ahead of his time, but he proved to me that he not only understood what those nursery rhymes were about, but he had the ability to paraphrase them in ways that made them his own. And paraphrase is one of those abilities that lets you know that kids have not only learnt the basic concept, but they've expanded it. And so paraphrase and transformation are the 2 most, I think, valid indicators of what kids have learned. And it's how you can assess them. And if you read our book, it gives you some ideas on doing that, particularly the area, the bit about transformation. Have a good look at it.
Sure. Thank you very much. We're also organizing the possibility of having some copies, actually getting some copies to make it part of our library, in the university. So we're going to look into it as well as that, as an important and necessary possibility, to have it, to have the whole picture of this updated revision of the conditions and the whole proposal that you have made for us. We really appreciate this space. It is a shame our time is over. Actually, it was over about 6 minutes ago, but still, I want to provide a final or concluding thought. I myself had a lot of questions, but we don't now have the time to go over. I think it will be interesting to think about a possibility of expanding this space with maybe a second session. Well, we'll look into the possibilities, but I would like to just real quick to close it by just sharing something that I've been thinking is, in this kind of fluid world that we live in, we're always eager for answers, right? Eager for answers and quick answers. We want quick answers and find quick answers to our questions. One of the questions that many novice or pre-service teachers have in regards to their profession and to our profession is, how do I teach, right? How do I teach? what do I have to do? Tell me what is it that I need to bring into the class in order to lead my students into actual learning. We are very concerned sometimes about the how, and we need to, hold it up for a moment and think about the why and the what, right? So I don't think there is a straightforward answer to the questions, how do I teach or what do I have to teach? Even thinking of it as in terms of a recipe, right? So guiding our teaching decisions by the learning conditions that we know take action or take place when it comes to any learning process is a way of bringing the theory into the practice. I mean, I think this wasn't a space for us to see that bringing theory into our practices is not as complex as many times some teachers believe. It means sometimes, especially novice teachers and pre-service teachers, see theory on the one side and practice in the others, and like two separate worlds. And I don't think that's the way it has to be. I think this space was a possibility to see how, again, teaching decisions can be based on theory, need to be based on actual theory, especially in this specific scenario, in the theories that we know in regards to the learning conditions, or the conditions better that make learning possible, whatever the scenario. Literacy, learning to talk, which is how the actual proposal of Brian Camber started off, like at least in an alternative of learning, how he explains it, and any type of learning, and we have mentioned before. So a second language, a foreign language, which is actually one of our biggest concern here, that most of us right here who are taking part of this space. We are teachers of a second language, of a foreign language, teachers of English as an additional language. And I think exploring what the conditions mean in terms of a teaching learning process of a second language is definitely a move that we all need to get to. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you being here, Richard, Deborah, Brian. I'm sorry I don't call doctor, but I feel we had a meeting before, so we had talked before, so I could go that. We really appreciate your space, your experiences, your reflections, and the possibilities you have brought about by being here with us. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you for having us. And I'm retired and I have a lot of time. I get up early every morning and I'm very flexible. I mean, Deborah and Richard still have full-time jobs. I don't. So if any of you want to communicate with me via email, I'm quite happy to receive email questions and respond. So don't feel shy about sending me questions or ideas, and I'll do my best to respond.
Thank you.
Okay.
I know I did it, and look, we're here, an initial moment, right? And that's how it started. I sent you an email just to get to know you. Yeah. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Richard. And we'll sure take that into consideration, that possibility that you are giving us, Dr. Brian.
Okay.
I'll pause the recording right there.